Olivia hit the ground, her notebook torn to shreds. Chad stood over her, sneering. "You don't belong here," he hissed. But then, Olivia's father walked in. The look in his eyes promised that Chad was about to learn a hard lesson. What happened next would shock everyone. It was a regular Tuesday afternoon at Jefferson High School. The halls buzzed with the usual chatter of students, the clinking of lockers, and the shuffle of sneakers against polished tile floors. Olivia Harris sat alone at the end of the cafeteria, her math notebook open on the table in front of her. She had just finished a particularly difficult set of equations, and a faint smile tugged at her lips as she double-checked her work. Math had always been her strong suit. Numbers made sense to her when the rest of the world often didn't. Olivia wasn't exactly popular, but that didn't bother her. She had a small circle of close friends, and most days, people left her alone. But she knew the unwritten rules of high school. If you stood out too much, people noticed. And if the wrong people noticed, things could get ugly. Olivia was confident, but not naive. She'd learned early that being a black girl in a mostly white school meant walking a tightrope between blending in and standing out. "Hey, Harris." Her body tensed at the sound of that voice. Chad Walker. She didn't look up at first, hoping he'd lose interest and go away. But Chad wasn't the type to back off once he found a target. He lived for this kind of attention. "Yo, Harris!" Chad repeated, louder this time. His voice carried easily over the dull cafeteria noise. Olivia's fingers curled around the edges of her notebook. She could feel the stares of the other students, some curious, some entertained, none sympathetic. Finally, she lifted her gaze. Chad Walker stood a few feet away, hands in the pockets of his varsity jacket, a lazy smirk stretched across his face. He was tall, lean, and blond. The golden boy of Jefferson High, captain of the football team, straight-A student, thanks to his father's contributions to the school, and practically untouchable. Everyone knew it. His father was Thomas Walker, a wealthy lawyer with deep connections in the community. Chad's two shadows, Jason and Trevor, stood at his side, grinning like hyenas. Olivia's eyes flicked toward the door, calculating her chances of slipping away without incident. Slim to none. "Wow, Harris, you're really studying hard," Chad said, his tone dripping with false admiration. "Trying to get into one of those Ivy League schools?" Olivia didn't respond. She focused on her notebook. Chad stepped closer. "Come on, Harris. Don't be rude." Jason snickered. "Yeah, show a little gratitude. Chad's talking to you." Olivia's jaw tightened. Chad's smirk widened. He reached down and snatched the notebook off the table. "Hey!" Olivia stood up. Chad flipped through the pages with exaggerated interest. "Wow, all these numbers. You're really trying, huh?" He tore out a page and crumpled it. "Give it back," Olivia said, her voice low and even. Chad smiled and held the notebook over his head. "Oh, you want it back?" "Chad," Olivia warned. "Come and get it." She took a step toward him, and Chad suddenly shoved her shoulder. Olivia stumbled back, bumping into the edge of the table. The cafeteria fell dead silent. Olivia's cheeks burned. She felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, but she forced them down. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "What's wrong?" Chad said, his voice mockingly soft. "Not so tough now, huh?" Jason and Trevor laughed. Other students whispered behind their hands, some filming with their phones. Olivia took a breath, trying to steady herself. But then Chad tore the notebook in half. The sound of paper ripping was sharp and cruel. Olivia's heart slammed against her ribcage. Pages fluttered to the floor at her feet. Olivia's fists tightened at her sides. "Oops," Chad shrugged. Jason and Trevor roared with laughter. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Olivia snapped. Chad stepped closer, towering over her. "You don't belong here, Harris," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Olivia's chest constricted. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. "You don't talk to her like that." The voice came from the cafeteria doorway, deep, cold. Every head turned. A tall figure stood silhouetted in the entrance. Darius Harris. Darius was 6'3", broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the calm, calculated presence of a man who had seen war and walked away unshaken. He was wearing a simple black t-shirt, jeans, and a leather jacket, but he may as well have been wearing armor. His dark brown eyes, the same ones Olivia had inherited, narrowed as they locked onto Chad. Chad's smirk wavered. Who are you?" Chad asked, his voice not nearly as confident as before. "I'm her father." Darius's voice was quiet but carried enough weight to crush stone. He stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Chad. "Hey, you shoved my daughter." Darius's jaw tightened. His eyes burned with cold fury. "And now you're going to apologize." Chad straightened his shoulders. "Or what?" Darius took another step toward him. Chad automatically stepped back. The cafeteria was so quiet that you could hear the hum of the vending machines. "Or I'll make sure you understand exactly what respect means," Darius said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Jason and Trevor suddenly found the floor very interesting. Chad's face paled, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. He forced a smirk. "Yeah? You're gonna hit me?" "No." Darius smiled faintly, a dangerous smile. "Because I'm not a child like you. But I promise you this. You won't walk away from this untouched." Chad's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Darius knelt and began gathering the torn pages of Olivia's notebook. He handed them to her gently. "You okay?" he asked softly. Olivia nodded, blinking back tears. Darius stood and looked back at Chad. "You have 5 seconds to apologize." Chad's eyes darted toward the crowd. He was trapped. If he backed down, he'd look weak. But if he didn't... "Apologize," Darius repeated. Chad swallowed. His face burned. "Sorry," he muttered. "Louder." Chad's jaw clenched. "I'm sorry." Darius smiled faintly. "Good. Now, get out of my sight." Chad hesitated for a moment, his hands balling into fists. But one look at Darius's cold stare was enough to make him turn and walk away. Jason and Trevor hurried after him. Darius watched them go, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Olivia and put a hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" She nodded. "You sure?" "Yeah." Darius's hand lingered for a moment. Then he sighed and squeezed her shoulder. "Come on. Let's go home." As they walked toward the cafeteria door, Olivia felt the weight in her chest start to lift. Her father had always taught her to stand tall, but sometimes even the strongest people need someone to have their back. Justice was coming, and Chad Walker had no idea what was waiting for him. Darius Harris stood at the school's front office, his jaw tight and his fists clenched at his sides. He had walked Olivia to the nurse's office to make sure she was okay, but now he was waiting outside Principal Roberts' office. His patience was wearing thin. Through the glass window of the office, he could see Chad Walker sitting casually in one of the leather chairs. Chad was slouched back, arms crossed over his chest, his expression bored. His father, Thomas Walker, sat beside him. An older version of Chad, with slicked-back blonde hair and the same arrogant smirk. Thomas was a powerful lawyer with deep ties to the community, and everyone knew it. The Walker name carried weight in this town. Darius could feel the anger burning in his chest. His daughter had been assaulted, humiliated, and now the school was about to sweep it under the rug because of the Walkers' influence. He had seen it happen before. Powerful families covering up their children's mistakes, allowing them to escape consequences. Not this time. "Mr. Harris?" A nervous-looking secretary stood nearby, her hands clasped in front of her. "Principal Roberts will see you now." Darius pushed open the glass door and stepped into the office, his eyes immediately locked onto Chad, whose smirk only deepened. Thomas Walker's gaze sharpened as Darius entered the room. "Mr. Harris," Principal Roberts said with forced politeness, gesturing toward the seat across from Chad and his father. "Please, have a seat." Darius didn't sit. He crossed his arms and stood over them. Principal Roberts cleared his throat. "I've gathered everyone here to discuss the misunderstanding that occurred earlier today." Darius's jaw tightened. "Misunderstanding?" "Yes, well," Roberts adjusted his glasses. "According to the statements I've gathered, Chad and Olivia had a small disagreement in the cafeteria. Emotions ran high and—" "Small disagreement?" Darius's voice was low and dangerous. "My daughter was shoved to the ground and humiliated in front of the entire school." Thomas Walker leaned back in his chair. "Oh, come on now," he said smoothly. "Boys will be boys." Darius's eyes narrowed. "Boys will be boys?" Thomas's smirk widened. "I'm sure your daughter is overreacting. Chad was just having a little fun. No harm done." Darius took a step closer. His eyes darkened. "You call shoving my daughter and tearing up her work fun?" Thomas sighed and turned toward Roberts. "Look, my son is a good kid. He's the captain of the football team. He's a straight-A student. Colleges are scouting him. Do you really want to jeopardize his future over this?" "This?" Darius repeated coldly. "You're talking about my daughter like she's an inconvenience." "I'm simply saying we need to have perspective." Darius's hands curled into fists. He could feel the rage building beneath his skin, hot and steady. He forced himself to stay calm. For now. Principal Roberts coughed awkwardly. "Yes, well, perhaps there's a way we can resolve this without any formal consequences." Darius's head snapped toward Roberts. "No formal consequences?" "Well, you see," Roberts said hesitantly, "Chad is a very important figure in this school. The football team has never performed better, and we—" Darius cut him off. "Let me get this straight. My daughter gets assaulted, publicly humiliated, and you're concerned about the football team?" Thomas smiled faintly. "I'm sure Olivia is resilient." Darius's fists tightened. Chad, who had been quiet up until now, suddenly leaned forward. His smirk widened. "Yeah, maybe Olivia should toughen up a little." Darius's chest burned. He took a step forward. "Enough," Thomas said, raising a hand. "Mr. Harris, we're not interested in making this into a bigger issue than it needs to be." Darius's eyes sharpened. "Oh, this is already a big issue." "You don't want to do this," Thomas said, his voice low and confident. "My family has a lot of influence in this town." Darius's lip curled. "Is that supposed to scare me?" "I'm just reminding you how things work around here." Darius took a steady breath. His hands relaxed at his sides, but his gaze remained hard. "You think because you have money and influence, you can buy your son's way out of this?" Darius said. Thomas smiled. "It's worked so far." Darius's eyes flashed dangerously. "You think this ends here?" Thomas's smile faltered. Darius leaned down so his face was inches from Thomas's. His voice was low and cold. "If this school tries to sweep this under the rug, I'll call the school board. I'll call the media. I'll call the police. I will make sure everyone knows exactly what your son did." Thomas's jaw tightened. And when they ask why Chad hasn't been held accountable, I'll make sure they know that Principal Roberts prioritized the football season over my daughter's safety. Principal Roberts paled. Now, Mr. Harris, there's no need. There's every need, Darius snapped. You are going to suspend Chad. You are going to remove him from the football team, and you are going to make him apologize to my daughter, publicly. Chad sat up, his smirk gone. Wait, what? Thomas's face flushed. That's absurd! Is it? Darius's smile was hard. Or maybe you'd prefer to explain to the media why this school protects bullies. Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but then he saw the look in Darius's eyes. Cold, unflinching, unbreakable. Principal Roberts swallowed nervously. I suppose that is within our disciplinary guidelines. Chad shot to his feet. You can't do that? You should have thought of that before you put your hands on my daughter, Darius said calmly. You can't ruin my future, Chad shouted. You ruined it yourself, Darius replied. Thomas stood. This is not over. It is, Darius said, his voice like ice. Thomas's mouth curled in anger. He grabbed Chad's arm. Come on. Chad shook his arm free. He turned toward Darius. This isn't fair. Darius's eyes narrowed. Fair? He took a step toward Chad. Chad instinctively stepped back. You think what you did to Olivia was fair? Darius's voice was low and dangerous. Chad's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Thomas pulled him toward the door. We're leaving. As they stormed out of the office, Darius turned toward Roberts. You have 24 hours to make this right, Darius said. Or I will. Principal Roberts nodded quickly. Darius left the office and walked toward the nurse's office where Olivia was waiting. She sat on the edge of the cot, her face still pale. Darius knelt in front of her and took her hand. You okay? Olivia nodded. Yeah. I'm handling it, Darius said softly. I know, Olivia whispered. Darius smiled faintly and kissed her forehead. No one puts their hands on you, Darius said. Ever. Olivia's lip trembled, but she smiled. I know. Darius squeezed her hand and stood. Justice was coming, and Chad Walker had no idea just how much it was going to hurt. The next morning, Olivia Harris sat at the kitchen table, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate with her fork. She hadn't touched a bite. The events of yesterday were still playing on a loop in her head. The sound of her notebook tearing, the way Chad's voice had dripped with mockery, the cruel laughter of his friends. But more than anything, she couldn't shake the look on her father's face when he had confronted Chad and his father in the office. Cold, controlled, dangerous. Darius Harris sat across from her, reading the morning paper. He was calm. Too calm. That was what worried Olivia. Her father had been in combat zones. He had seen and done things that he rarely spoke about. When other men would have lost control, Darius always maintained his composure. But Olivia could feel the quiet rage beneath the surface now, simmering just beneath his stoic exterior. You should eat, Darius said without looking up from the paper. Olivia sighed. Not hungry. You have school today. I don't want to go, Olivia admitted. Darius's eyes lifted from the paper. His gaze sharpened. You're not letting them scare you. Olivia's eyes flashed. It's not about being scared. Then what is it? It's... Olivia hesitated. What's the point? Chad's not going to get punished. His dad will pull strings and everything will go back to normal. Except now everyone will think I'm weak. Darius set the paper down. His expression darkened. He's not getting away with it. Olivia frowned. How can you be so sure? Darius's jaw tightened. Because I made sure Principal Roberts understood what was at stake. A knock at the door interrupted them. Darius stood, his expression hardening. He opened the door to find Principal Roberts standing on the porch, clutching a manila folder in one hand. He smiled weakly. "Mr. Harris," Roberts said. "Principal Roberts." Darius's tone was cold. Roberts's smile wavered. "May I come in?" Darius didn't answer. He just stepped aside, letting Roberts into the house. Olivia watched from the kitchen table as her father crossed his arms and stood by the door. Robert sat down awkwardly on the edge of the couch. He cleared his throat. "I wanted to inform you that we've reached a decision regarding Chad Walker." Darius's expression didn't change. "And?" Roberts adjusted his tie. "Chad will be suspended for 2 weeks." Olivia's eyes widened. "What?" Darius's gaze sharpened. "Not enough." Roberts shifted uncomfortably. "We also decided that Chad will be removed as captain of the football team. He'll be required to complete sensitivity training and issue a written apology to Olivia." Olivia sat up straighter. "Wait, really?" Roberts nodded. Darius's eyes narrowed. "A written apology." Roberts swallowed. "He'll also apologize in person. Publicly." Olivia's jaw dropped. Chad Walker, the golden boy of Jefferson High, forced to apologize publicly. Darius's gaze remained cold. "When?" "Today," Roberts said. "During lunch, in front of the entire student body." Olivia's heart began to race. "Dad?" Darius's face remained unreadable. "That's a start." Robert stood. "I hope this resolves the matter." Darius's eyes flashed dangerously. "That depends on how sincere the apology is." Roberts gave a nervous smile and hurried toward the door. As he left, Darius stood motionless for a long moment, his expression carved from stone. Finally, Olivia broke the silence. "Dad?" He turned toward her. "You really think he's going to mean it?" Darius's mouth twitched into a faint smile. "No." At lunchtime, Olivia stood at the edge of the cafeteria, her arms crossed over her chest. The entire school was gathered in the lunchroom. There was a low hum of whispers as the students waited, their attention focused on the small platform set up at the front of the room. Chad stood at the center of the platform. He wore his Letterman jacket, but the cocky smirk was gone. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Jason and Trevor stood near the back of the crowd, watching nervously. Principal Roberts stood beside Chad, his expression stern. He tapped the microphone. "Everyone, may I have your attention?" The chatter died down. "As you are all aware, there was an incident yesterday involving Chad Walker and Olivia Harris. Chad has been disciplined according to school policy. And now Chad would like to say something." The microphone was passed to Chad. He stared at it like it was a snake about to bite him. Chad took a breath and forced a smile. "I just want to say, I'm sorry." Silence. Principal Roberts' eyes narrowed. "Chad." Chad's smile twisted into a sneer. "I mean, it was just a joke, right? I didn't think it was that serious." Darius's face darkened from where he stood at the back of the cafeteria. "You call pushing me to the ground a joke?" Olivia's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Chad's smile faltered. He turned toward her. "Look, Harris, No," Olivia interrupted. Her voice was steady. "Say it like you mean it." Chad's eyes narrowed. "You think you're better than me? You think you're untouchable?" Olivia shot back. Chad's eyes burned with frustration. His father, standing at the edge of the cafeteria, motioned for him to stop talking. But Chad's temper got the better of him. "I didn't even push you that hard," Chad snapped. "Maybe you should toughen up." Gasps filled the room. Darius took a step forward, his face deadly calm. Principal Roberts' face paled. Chad! Chad's gaze flicked toward his father, but Thomas's expression had darkened with cold calculation. You know what? Olivia's voice trembled. Forget the apology. It's worthless coming from you. Chad's eyes flashed. I don't care anyway. Darius's jaw tightened. Then maybe you need another lesson. Chad's mouth curled into a smirk. Oh yeah? What are you going to do about it? Darius stepped forward. He was calm. Too calm. The cafeteria was so quiet that you could hear the sound of Olivia's breath quickening. Principal Roberts stepped between them. Enough. Darius's eyes never left Chad. This isn't over. Thomas suddenly stepped forward, his voice sharp. Yes, it is. Darius turned toward him. You're protecting him? Thomas's eyes narrowed. I'm protecting his future. Darius's expression didn't change. So am I. Principal Roberts stepped in. Chad will serve his suspension starting tomorrow. Chad scoffed. Whatever. Darius's gaze remained hard. He knelt beside Olivia. You okay? She nodded, but her eyes still burned with quiet anger. Darius stood. His gaze lingered on Chad for a long moment. This isn't finished. Chad's smirk returned. Yeah, it is. Darius smiled faintly. We'll see. As they walked out of the cafeteria, Olivia's heart was still racing. She had faced Chad. She had stood up to him. But somehow it still didn't feel like enough. It had been 3 days since Chad Walker's pathetic apology. Olivia Harris sat beneath the shade of an old oak tree in the school courtyard, her notebook balanced on her knees. A light breeze rustled the leaves above her, and the sun filtered through the branches, casting soft patterns on the ground. She should have felt better. Chad had been humiliated. In front of the entire school, no less. He had been suspended, removed as captain of the football team, and forced to apologize publicly. Justice had been served. So why did it still feel like something was unfinished? Hey. Olivia glanced up to see Maya and Danielle standing nearby. Her 2 closest friends had been walking on eggshells around her since the incident, unsure of what to say. Mind if we sit? Maya asked. Olivia nodded. Danielle sat down beside her, brushing her long braids over her shoulder. So, how are you? I'm fine, Olivia said automatically. You don't look fine, Maya said. Olivia sighed. It's just, I don't know. He apologized. He got punished. I should feel better, right? Danielle frowned. You don't think he meant it? Of course he didn't, Olivia said. He was forced. Maya bit her lip. Yeah, but it's still something. Olivia's fingers tightened around the edge of her notebook. He didn't mean it. He's not sorry. Danielle leaned back against the tree trunk. So what would make you feel better? Olivia didn't have an answer. A sudden wave of noise rose from the other side of the courtyard. Students were gathering in small groups, talking excitedly. Olivia glanced toward the commotion and spotted Chad Walker standing near the school's main entrance. He wasn't alone. Thomas Walker stood beside him, his polished suit practically gleaming in the sunlight. His expression was cold and calculating as he spoke quietly to Principal Roberts, who stood looking deeply uncomfortable. What's going on? Maya asked. Let's find out, Danielle said, standing. Olivia followed them toward the crowd, her chest tightening as they got closer. I don't care about your policy, Thomas was saying, his voice sharp and controlled. My son deserves to play. Principal Roberts' face flushed red. Mr. Walker, the board made their decision. Chad will not be reinstated as captain of the football team. Thomas's eyes narrowed dangerously. My family has done a lot for this school. If you think we're going to let this go... You're not in charge here, Mr. Walker, Roberts said, his voice tightening. The decision stands. Chad's face twisted into an angry scowl. This is so unfair. Unfair? Olivia's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Chad's head snapped toward her. Olivia stepped forward, her chin raised. You think it's unfair? After what you did? Chad's eyes darkened. Stay out of this, Harris. Thomas's smile was thin and dangerous. This doesn't concern you, Olivia. Darius's voice came from behind her. It concerns her more than anyone. The crowd parted as Darius Harris walked toward them, his stride measured and calm. He was wearing a simple black jacket and jeans, but he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. Thomas's smile vanished. Mr. Harris. Darius's gaze didn't waver. Thomas. Thomas's jaw tightened. You've made quite a mess for my son. Darius smiled faintly. No, your son made this mess for himself. You don't understand how things work in this town, Thomas said. We have influence. We have power. You think I care about that? Darius's tone sharpened. Your son assaulted my daughter. Oh, come on, Thomas said. He barely touched her. Darius's eyes darkened. Do you want to find out what happens if someone really touches her? Chad stepped toward Darius. What's your problem, man? Darius's expression remained cold. My problem is that you think you can do whatever you want without consequences. Thomas's smile sharpened. Careful, Mr. Harris. You wouldn't want to threaten us. I don't make threats, Darius said. I make promises. Thomas's eyes flashed with warning. We'll see about that. Darius took a slow step toward him. The tension between them was electric, the kind of tension that made people hold their breath and step back. Your son is done, Darius said quietly. No more football. No more special treatment. He's going to face the consequences, just like everyone else. Chad scoffed. You think you're a hero? Darius's gaze shifted toward Chad. No. His eyes darkened. But I am her father. The silence was deafening. Thomas straightened his tie. You'll regret this. Darius's smile didn't reach his eyes. No, you will. Thomas's jaw tightened. Let's go, Chad. Chad hesitated, his eyes burning with resentment. But when his father turned toward the parking lot, Chad followed. The crowd began to disperse as Thomas and Chad stalked toward their car. Olivia stood frozen for a moment before she turned toward Darius. Dad. Darius's expression softened. You okay? Olivia swallowed. Yeah, I don't know how you stay so calm. Darius smiled faintly. I wasn't calm. I was just focused. Olivia hesitated. And what if Chad comes after me again? Darius's gaze sharpened. He won't. How can you be so sure? Because he knows now that if he touches you again, I won't stop at a conversation. Olivia's lips curled into a faint smile. What if he tries to get back on the team? He won't, Darius said. How do you know? Darius's smile widened. Because I had a conversation with the school board this morning. Olivia's eyes widened. You didn't. Darius's expression was hard. They agreed that anyone with a history of harassment or violence is ineligible for a leadership position, including team captain. Olivia's mouth opened, then closed. Darius smiled faintly. Justice. Olivia took a shaky breath. Thank you. Darius's smile softened. He reached out and tucked a loose curl behind her ear. You never have to thank me for protecting you. Olivia's heart swelled. Darius glanced toward the parking lot where Thomas and Chad were pulling away in their car. His smile faded. This isn't over, Olivia whispered. No, Darius said. But Chad Walker knows better now. And if he doesn't? Olivia asked. Darius's smile was cold. Then he'll find out the hard way. Olivia's smile widened. For the first time since the incident, she felt light. Darius put an arm around her shoulder. Come on, let's go home. As they walked toward the car, Olivia glanced over her shoulder. Chad was gone. But the weight on her chest was gone too. Justice had been served, and Chad Walker wouldn't forget it.